Sometimes I have trouble dealing with my own existence, coming to the realization that all eternity and all possibilities within that exist. You also have to come to terms that all conceivable horror and mayhem contained within that eternity also exists and will always exist because there is no time. Being empathetic towards suffering, this brings to me tremendous amount of internal sorrow and grief to know that this is the case. Even on our own planet here, there seems to be no limitations to what we do to each other, to how much horror we inflict upon each other. And there doesn't seem to be many forces that are stopping our actions. And we're all to an extent guilty of this. We're all guilty of bloodshed. If you eat a cow, you are guilty of bloodshed, as am I. You are guilty of hurting those animals. But this is how this realm is structured. It is structured so that everything feeds off of one another and overpowers the less fortunate, the weaker. And this is both true for the animal kingdom as it is for the human kingdom. At least that is how we perceive it. Now the question is, do I believe that man has fallen into this decay, this spiritual, psychological, mental decay? And yes, and along with man came the animals. There was a point where they did not eat each other. I truly believe this and know this in my heart. I do not believe the standard explanation of evolution and how things came about. I believe life is far more dynamic and complex and more cyclical as well, in that there are cyclical patterns in both the decay and the downgrading of consciousness and the uplifting. I understand how this process could be necessary in that duality teaches a soul certain things. For example, how could you know what pleasure is if you've never felt pain? How could you know what joy is if you've never felt sorrow? Now, this is perfectly legitimate and understandable that a soul must learn these two different opposing forces in order to have an appreciation for the eternal light and love of God. But there seems to be something here that is so grotesque and exceeding in hideousness that I can only conclude that there has to be something more than just your standard dualistic soul growth process taking place here. There must be a parasitic nature to the realm because of just how much suffering there has been and there is now. Now, I'm not taking away from the human responsibility of our own actions. We have been poor and terrible stewards of our planet, and we have been poor and terrible stewards of one another and of the plants and of the animals, and we use and abuse our resources, and we use and abuse each other. But there is something underlying that. Now, some people might call this sin, but it can't be that simple. We have to elaborate. We have to elaborate what triggers these sort of sick and twisted thought processes that enable a person to have the desire to inflict harm on others. Why are countless millions choosing to go to war and choosing to suffer on behalf of some government agencies? Why are they sacrificing and laying down their lives? Why are millions choosing to go through this grotesque horror? And then the horror of war is by far not limited just to soldiers. It has a greater effect on the civilians. And yet we continuously doing it and we cannot stop. That is why there has to be some truth to the notion of sin in Christianity and Christ bringing about that rebalancing. Because this is not normal. Even though all possibilities have to exist and have to be met, I still feel like something is terribly wrong. And also knowing that there is a very real possibility that many of us have had previous lives, both here and on other worlds. And then you have to sit there and wonder, what grotesque actions have you taken against another? Were you that torturer in the previous lifetime? Were you the one that killed and murdered? Now, maybe you should say, well, you shouldn't judge because everything has a divine purpose. I agree that everything does have a divine purpose. But should we not learn self-control? Should we not learn to overcome these things? Isn't it a process of breaking those barriers and exceeding our mental anguish into a higher place, back towards God, not to have this cyclical reoccurring pattern? Now that makes me wonder, so if the earth is cyclical, is this just without end? Is this some form of spiritual slavery? I would like to think that as opposed to a cyclical pattern in the cycles of earth and creation, that we just keep ascending upward. Why is it that we have to keep devolving backwards? Why can't we continuously ascend upwards? Maybe perhaps it's a zigzag pattern. I don't know. But I'm deeply troubled at times with my own existence and with my own soul because I don't want to be that hideous person. And we all have the potential to be that, depending on the circumstances we're thrown in. Everyone has the potential for evil. So we have to stay strong and pray to God that we maintain that self-control. But we're all, in a sense, guilty of bloodshed. I don't really know why I'm making this video. I sometimes struggle with existence and the nature of life itself. And I sometimes sit here and wonder if it's better for nothing to exist instead. If it's better for all the sorrow and all the grief and all the misery just to go away and never be there again. But it can't, because God cannot cease to exist. And perhaps God does not know why God exists. And there is a sense of loneliness and desperation upon this eternal being to understand who or what he is and why he exists. And he does that through us as individuated units. And he puts us through hell and hellfire. And to perhaps get some sort of energetic signature from the experiences we go through that will enable to discover God's existence, to enable to discover God's initiation into existence. If God indeed did come out of nowhere, I think he simultaneously existed eternally and simultaneously came out of nowhere. Both are true, just as creation has never started and yet it has always been here. There is always a divine contradiction. everything contradicts itself. It is and yet it isn't, and therefore God is and God isn't. So nothing does exist and yet it does. Anyway, have a good day. Ponder who you are as a soul. That's all I ask.